I'd like to thank you all very much for inviting me here to Sweden. Now, can you hear me at the back? Yes? And can you understand my English? A bit louder. Okay. Is my English okay for you? Thank you so much for inviting me here, and it's a real pleasure to be here. And I'd like to thank Oren very much for all the hard work that he's put into organising this trip. It's wonderful to be here. I wasn't certain that there would be any Swede here this evening at all. 9 o'clock, front of the telly. In actual fact, you might have been rather wondering whether I would be here because we're actually playing now. But it is a real pleasure. Now, the topics that Goran was talking about are far too large to address. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to touch upon a number of things peripherally, but what I really want to do is to talk to you about the model of dying that I now have been thinking a lot about. And it composes two components, the near-death experience and approaching death experiences. So what we'll do is we'll look at that. We'll look a little bit at the research. How many of you are coming on Saturday? Okay, well, there's going to be some crossover, but I'll try and do things slightly differently on Saturday. But there's bound to be some crossover, so at any rate. So if you want to go and watch the match.
No.
So we're all in a very, very exciting time now. And when I say exciting, I really mean it. And that's because spiritual medicine is very high on the agenda, or becoming higher and higher on the agenda of medical schools. And why? Because it works. And that is the astonishing thing. I won't go into the evidence for spiritual medicine this evening, but just to point out, in 1995 there were 3 US medical schools which were teaching a course on spiritual medicine. And this was sponsored by the Templeton Foundation. Do you all know the Templeton Foundation? Mm-hmm. Sir Jack Templeton, he's English, and he made a lot of money. When I say a lot of money, I mean a lot of money. And he went across the States and endowed the Templeton Foundation. And it is his desire that the Templeton Prize for Religion and Science should always be a greater sum of money than the Nobel Prize. In fact, what he's arguing is that it should in fact become as prestigious as the Nobel Prize. Well, it hasn't quite yet, but it's up there among the prizes that you ought to win. So don't forget to put your names forward, because it's a lot of money. At any rate, he had this wonderful idea, and that was that he would get 3 medical schools to compete for a course in spiritual medicine, and that they would then be awarded a rather small sum of money. I think it was $500 or something. And so these 3 medical schools made a protocol, and then by 1998 it had spread to 40 medical schools, with Larson there being the one of the main people. By 2001 there was 100 medical schools, and now almost every medical school in the USA teaches a course on spiritual medicine. I mean, it's amazing. Mm-hmm. In December of 1997, Harvard had its first conference on prayer, which was sponsored by Benson. And then in 1999, and I'm pleased to say they were initially network members, they formed within the British Psychological Society a section on transpersonal or spiritual psychology. So this is the main academic body in the UK, now has a special interest group on spiritual psychology. But what's even more amazing to me, because I'm a neuropsychiatrist, is that the Royal College of Psychiatrists, and again, it was the network really which drove this, they have got a special interest group in spiritual psychiatry. Now, a special interest group you can only get if you get 150 signatures, and then it has to go up to the councils and so on. But the politics was done well. We got 150 signatures and it went through. Now, most special interest groups will have about 200, 300 people. You know, child psychiatry, forensic psychiatry, drug psychiatry, that sort of thing. Would any of you like to guess what we've got up to now? We're over 1,200 psychiatrists in our special interest group. There is huge interest. There are only 6,000 psychiatrists in England. So there is this huge drive and the recognition, certainly within our academic bodies in the UK, that spiritual psychology, spiritual psychiatry have been neglected. And we're teaching our young junior doctors now to take a spiritual history when they take their psychiatric history. So you take a social history, you take a mental state, you take a physical examination, you also take a spiritual history. It's really good. So things are changing, and that's why I say it's so important. If any of you are able to get access to a library and want them to buy a book, then go for this one. It's the Handbook of Religion and Health. And it's, again, Larsing and Koenig are the authors, and it's published by Oxford University Press in 2001. So it's the Handbook of Religion and Health. And there you will find a treasure trove of studies, high-quality academic studies showing the effects of spiritual medicine. And you'll notice the relationship between that and this. And it's one of the most influential books in that area. Any of you seen it? Okay, well, you've got a joy coming to you if you're interested in academic medicine. So, what are we going to do this evening? We're going to do two things. Approaching death experiences. These are in the 24 hours before you die. There are a whole set of phenomena which I'll go into and talk to you about. Is it loud enough at the back? Yes? Can you hear? And we'll talk a little bit about near-death experiences. Don't you love this picture? There, she's ill, you see. Actually, I'm worried about this reflecting off the wall because you have to point at it straight. So this is when she's ill and just about to die. Those are the approaching death experiences. And I'm going to take the near-death experience as some evidence for that phase, and I'll explain to you why. Okay, so the aim of the talk is near-death research. The beginning, retrospective studies we'll look a little bit at. We'll look at the present prospective studies, but I won't go into it in too much detail because we'll be doing that on Saturday. And we'll look at the future, the process of dying, spirituality and consciousness research. So what did we learn from retrospective studies? Well, we learned a lot about the phenomenology, the prevalences, circumstances, and cultural differences. That's all well established in the literature now. And so I'll go into just a few points from the retrospective studies. And I want to start with a study which we did. It's a fairly old study now. It's 4 or 5 years old. But it's one of the largest studies there is, so I think it's worth revisiting it. In 1987, we did a television program which was called Glimpses of Death. And in 1987, there were in fact very little information on near-death experiences in the UK. So it was the first program. And so you can imagine that all these people had near-death experiences, told by their doctors just ignore them, they're nothing of interest. And feeling very unhappy about this, they were delighted when the program came on. They started to understand them, and so they all wrote in. So we got 2,000 letters. We took from those 500 of what we felt were the true, genuine near-death experiences, and we sent out a questionnaire. We got 450 replies. So our data sample was 450. And you'll never get another sample like that again. For those of you who can't see, it says 98%, almost the whole sample, knew nothing about NDEs when they had their experiences. So it's a unique sample because you'll never get that again now. Women were 76%, men were 24%. Obviously, men are very unspiritual, women are very spiritual. Actually, I don't think it's anything to do with that. I think women write letters, men don't. It's as simple as that. But what came out very clearly is that we had equal numbers in each decade of life. So no decade was privileged, which I didn't think would be so, but it did come out that way, up to 60 years of age. So age isn't a factor in whether you get the experience or not. Religious interest, what we found then, had been found in many other studies. If you look at the breakdown of the people who answered the questions, you'll see that half were Church of England, but in half religion was not important. We had some nice atheists, and there were one or two lovely atheist NDEs. One man was enormously cross when he had his experience. But I think this is more or less the makeup of distribution of religion in England. Yeah.
That's almost the English distribution of people also.
Yes. Yes. Okay. Yes. So it means that it's a good sample of British people. So there's nothing which selects for the NDE in terms of religion. Now, circumstances, and when I saw these results, I realized that you cannot do NDE research properly unless you take very specific subsets, because look at this, 23% or a quarter, there was an illness. Well, what's an illness? Okay, so their doctor said they were seriously ill. What does seriously ill mean? It's very difficult. Operation, what sorts of operation? Was it during the operation? Was it as they were recovering? Or was it in childbirth? Did they have gas and air? Did they get their out-of-body experiences then? An accident, how severe was it? But there is this one, and that's heart attack. And heart attack seemed to me to be the best way to go to look at near-death experiences, because we know the physiology of what happens when your heart stops. We know that the way that the brain systems decay. We understand exactly what's going on. And so it means that everything is the same. But not only that, in the UK, you have what are called resuscitation officers, and these are attached to every hospital. And they go round and they check on the resuscitation that's being carried out by the junior doctors who are usually there. And what they do is the resuscitation is to a protocol. And so when the crash trolley comes along, they get pumped a number of times, they get given their adrenaline shots, and so on. So the whole thing's to a protocol. So everybody's treated the same. So you know exactly what's going on. And it's nothing, there are no other drugs apart from those in the protocol used. But do look at this. 2% occurred during suicides, but the 20% others, and look at the others. Anxiety states, okay, fear-death experiences, nothing strange there. But look, dreams, people had really very comprehensive dreams which were so near-death-like that we selected them on their accounts. You couldn't draw a distinction. And during relaxation and spontaneous. But remember, these people had not heard about near-death experiences. So it means that near-death experiences occur in a huge number of circumstances. And unless you take that into account when you're researching near-death experiences, and be very careful about what you're doing and the situations that the people are in, you're going to confuse a large number of variables. Only a third were on drugs. And people, at that time, we all felt that drugs were important, but in fact they haven't turned out to be, because you can argue that 2/3 weren't on drugs. Okay, what was the phenomenology? There isn't anybody here who's not heard about the near-death experience, is there? Okay, so it means that I can go through this really very quickly for you, because you all know about it. Calmness in almost everyone. Out-of-body experiences in 2/3. The tunnel in 56%. Being of light in half. Pastoral landscapes in 3/4. Meeting friends and relatives, really interesting that. Nice papers on that. 38%. life review, rather surprisingly few people with a life review, only 12%. Then we come to the barrier, and remember that they've gone into a garden. Most of our people had. And so what was the barrier like? Well, it was a stream, a bridge, a gate in the wall, or just the knowledge that if you went further, then you would die and not come back. Decision to return in about 3/4 of them. Now, the decision was sometimes their own, so they would choose to come back, and sometimes they were sent back. And why did people choose to come back? Well, the childbirth ones, it's easy to see. They came back to look after their babies mainly. But you get very strange reasons. One of our women came back because she had to do the family ironing. Now, how many of you would come back and do the family ironing? And then transformation in, again, 3/4. Now, hellish experiences are very few. Do you see they're 4%? Let's just talk a little bit about hellish experiences. Hellish experiences usually contain two or three components: a sulphurous pit, a devil, pitchforks, that sort of thing, and people out to get them and to kill them. And why are there only 4%? Well, supposing you'd had an experience in which you'd been pulled into a pit with sulphurous fumes, and somebody had told you that you were bad and wicked, would you write into some guy who's just given a television program on this and tell him about it? No way. So they're going to be underrepresented. But the sorts of accounts we got, and looking into the literature since then, I don't think that hellish experiences are near-death experiences, and I'll explain to you why. One of our accounts was of a man who was roasting in hell, and there were devils about pushing pitchforks into him, and he was feeling really angry and tormented by this. And as he came to full consciousness, he realized that the fire of hell was the heating pad that he was on in the intensive care unit, and the pitchforks were the injections that the nurses were given. And the feelings that people were against him were strong paranoid feelings which disappeared over the next few days. So what he had was an intensive care psychosis, and it has all those components to it. They're illusory and they're paranoid. And so I think that all the near-death experiences I've seen, apart from some exotic American ones, are in fact, I think, intensive care psychoses and are not true near-death experiences. So I think that you can draw a line, and I certainly would try and draw a line.
The label transformation.
Yeah.
What does it mean here?
Oh, transformation, I'm so sorry. What it means is they were spiritually transformed. It's a portmanteau, because we divided it up into, were they socially more aware? Were they less involved with materialistic things? So were their relationships improved? Were they more improved with material things? Were they less involved?
And that's after.
This is all after. Yeah. This is all after. This is change.
Most of these experiences through at the time when it happens. The transformation is sort of happening afterwards.
The transformation is happening after. And the problem about any retrospective study is you just take a cross-section. You write your letter, this is what they say. And so you have to wait to the prospective studies to understand how transformation has evolved. But the 72% contained all those dimensions. So these were people who had transformed in some way. Well, here it is. Wonderful, isn't it? We got a number of people who were flower specialists. And so one of the questions which we asked them was, did they see any new species of flowers? Because very high colours, beautiful scents, and wonderful vistas of these flowers. But nobody said that they'd seen any new types or kinds. So you had this wonderful English garden with the most beautiful flowers. But what about that one? Were there lots of those around? Because you'd expect there might be. But in actual fact, you'd be pleased to hear that not one was seen. They didn't see any scorpions, they didn't see any snakes, they didn't see anything like that. It was mainly beautiful flowers, very positive feel for a garden. And lots of bird song, tons of bird song, and lots of heavenly music. What's heavenly music? Concordant Baroque music, mainly. Nobody that I spoke to had any rock bands, and certainly reggae and so on wasn't thought of then. But one or two people said that they heard all the music, and so one can't actually understand what that means, but they weren't differentiating into type of music. They heard all the music, not just heavenly music. But the greatest number was heavenly music. So who'd you meet? Certainly in our sample, mainly dead relatives, occasionally strangers. If I speak to the board, can you hear at the back? If I turn away from you? Yes?
It's difficult to hear you.
Is it?
Yeah.
Then what I need to do is come closer to you, which I can do. I'll use my pointer, and if I'm down here, then I don't think it'll reflect off the board. No, it doesn't. Okay. Is this better? Yes? Okay, well, let's do that then. Culturally determined, mainly dead relatives, occasionally strangers. Now, this is a fascinating fact. Do note it, that they tend to be seen in the prime of life. And if your relative had an injury of any sort, when they came back in the near-death experience, they were in fact whole, but they weren't only whole, they were in their 30s to 40s. And so there's this transformation into a whole adult person. People who are not known to the dead were also seen. They didn't know that so-and-so had died, but yet in their experience they met them. They were welcoming, and often they sent people back. Now, the tunnel I became really interested in, and I became interested in the tunnel because of one experience from a woman who had meningitis. And she was obviously seriously ill. Remember, 10% of people die with meningitis. And she said that she floated out of her body, and she was able to say that when she floated out of her body, she could see it was a lovely sunny day outside. I think this actually was the beginning of the near-death experience. And she thought, well, I'm going to float out of the window. But she didn't. A big hole occurred in the ceiling, and she went through the tunnel, and she went into that hole, which turned out to be a tunnel with the light. Now, why? If you try expectation theories and so on, you should go through the window. You wouldn't put a black hole in the ceiling and go through it. So what does the tunnel signify? And do other cultures have different tunnels? So we looked at our series. And this, of course, is Hieronymus Bosch. Sorry, it's not a very good picture, but what you have to see is there's the angel, and there's the person being taken down the tunnel by the angel. So showing that tunnels and near-death experience was common in our culture. In fact, the earliest one that I've found is one which was Plato described. The commonest one, I think, was this sort of tunnel. It's not really a tunnel. It's more a floating in a blackness towards a light. Do you see? Yeah.
I thought about the fact that sometimes when you rise very quickly and the oxygen, whatever gets out of the brain, you get tunnel vision. So that might be a physiological thing of the brain feeling too little energy. And
yeah. Could you all hear that? Susan Blakemore is very, very keen on the idea that as you faint, your blood pressure falls, and therefore you get retinal ischemia, and therefore you get tunnel vision. In actual fact, the tunnels which people describe are not like the tunnel which you find in ischemia. As you'll see in a moment, they are very diffuse in kind and nature. So if you actually study what people say, it won't fit into that category. And not only that, for other reasons later on, I don't think that's a tenable hypothesis. It might be in people who, for some reason, are fainting, and for some reason their near-death experience is part of their faint. They may get a constriction. But as a general cause of tunnels, it won't fit. And as you'll see, that floating in a blackness, you see, floating in the blackness with a light of some sort doesn't fit into anoxia. And I'm going to tell you about the most anoxic state you can have when your heart stops and you don't get that sort of data. This was the tunnel that she went down, which was just like a spin dryer. And she described these ridged sides to it, and then going right down to the end and finally into the light. Other people describe whirling-like tunnels like that, which swing round. And of course one's interested in whether this is part of the vestibular apparatus, which is affected in some way, producing a swirling motion. But it's difficult to fit it into that. Japanese have quite different tunnels. They have a cave that you go into, so you may go into a sort of cave. Sometimes there's spirits there, but the commonest Japanese one is that, which is a dark river going on to a dark bank like that, and there's a ferryman who comes across and gets you and takes you across. So you have to accept that to some extent the form the tunnel takes is cultural, although I think that there are Japanese ones which have more of a European tunnel as well. So it's got a large cultural component to it. Now, if you look at hunter-gatherers, how do they get and where do they go? I could only find 25 cases, not in our series, of hunter-gatherers. And the commonest thing was to paddle a canoe. And they paddled for 3 days before they got to an island. And guess what was on the island? Beautiful flowers. It's exactly the same sort of thing. But you had to paddle for 3 days to get to it. And I was interested in the journey back. The journey back, like it is with all ours, instantaneous. Yeah.
I have the question, did anyone describe the nature of the darkness itself?
Yes, they do. The nature of the darkness is described as, quite often it's just got an emotional feel to it, of being friendly. Sometimes it's described as a living darkness. Nobody feels it's the sort of darkness that you get lost in. They feel happy with their floating through the darkness. So it's not seen in any sense as antagonistic to them. So, less fear of dying and transformation. So let's move on to points from retrospective studies. So these are other people's studies. So this is Grayson, 203, 272 patients who had a brush with death. Now, there is one thing which you must keep in mind, if you would, whenever you look at the near-death literature. Remember that you don't actually know what happened to these people. Some of them will have been seriously ill, and others won't have been ill at all. The ones who are seriously ill quite often were in accidents, or may have had conditions which affected their brains, and so suffering from brain damage. And so you have to say to yourself, when you look at the literature, are these people to some extent brain damaged? So 272 patients, 22% of those had NDEs, and they were found to be less psychologically disturbed than those who did not have NDEs. But the whole group of people, the NDEs were more anxious than a control group. Anybody who had an NDE was more anxious on the symptom checklist than people who didn't. But if you had an NDE, then you were protected to some extent. So there is a relationship then between a high score on the symptom checklist profile and NDEs. Here's another one which came out in 2004 by Willoughby. I'll talk more about this tomorrow. It's an EEG study. And here they looked at a group of NDEs and found that they had left temporal sharp waves. but the reason they had left temporal shockwave, we don't know, because he didn't say whether they were a brain damaged population or not. So, again, it's difficult. But he had 23 NDEs, 20 controls, and he found the NDE group scored more highly on a coping scale, planning, positive reinterpretation, and growth. And there was no difference in post-traumatic scores between that and the control. So the suggestion there is that in his group of NDEs, they in fact were better. Now, this study needs repeating, and if any of you want a project, a nice ND project for you, or an MA project, Grayson in '86 found an association of suicide with NDEs. Now, why? This was in an outpatient population. This was, yes, in an outpatient population of people who'd attempted suicide, and a quarter of people who had attempted suicide had NDEs. Don't you find that really high? I mean, I'd love to see that repeated. Maybe in Virginia there is something that relates suicide to NDEs. But we only got 2% in our study. And I think we need to do further work to find out what the relationship to NDEs and suicide is. But not only that, we need to find out what effect having an NDE after a suicide attempt makes. Now, I can quote 2 cases to you. One is the girl who came into hospital after an attempted suicide. She went into the light. She felt the warmth and love and compassion, feelings she'd never really had before. And she was in hospital for a year, and we had terrible trouble with her, trying to stop her attempting to get back there. So she was specialed by a nurse with a cord, taking away her cords when she had them, because she would use her dressing gown cord. She'd use anything to try and strangle herself. It took us a year, but she after that was okay, and she went on. The other one was a Welsh farmer, and after his NDE, he had a cardiac arrest. He went home. He just sat in his chair. He said, "No, I don't want to go on living. I just want to sit here." And he became profoundly depressed and anergic. And the local psychiatric services had a lot of difficulty with him. But they're unusual, but you do get it. Okay, prospective studies. Now, these are the really interesting studies, and this, I think, is the cutting edge of NDE research. Children's NDEs. You all know Melvin Morse's study, probably. And this is just a little one which was done in the UK just recently. It was done by Daniel Shears at Guy's Hospital. And he was looking at children's near-death experiences in meningitis. And I've told you already that there's a high mortality with meningitis. Now, here's some stories for you, just little stories. 3.5-year-old boy, 3 months after the meningococcal disease, when Shears went back to ask him, he said, "Yes, 2 angels took me, a big angel and a boy angel." And then he met with Grandad and played with toys and other children. And then the angels brought me back down. So a good NDE, a nice simple one for children. But note that his Grandad actually died just after he got meningitis and went into hospital. But because he was only 3, I mean, his concept of time is so loose, one doesn't know whether or not his experience was before or after his Grandad had died. It's just an interesting relationship. Here's another one. 4-year-old boy. 2 weeks after discharge from hospital, a man with wings came to see me when I was in hospital. Aren't you fascinated by the wings? At 4, are you taught about angels and wings? Probably. Have you all taught your kids about angels have wings? Do Swedish kids have angels with wings? Could see him out of the corner of his eye. And then he obviously had an out-of-body experience, which is a little difficult. He recalls his grandmother talking to him at this point, but he couldn't tell her to shut up, as he was asleep. So, do you see, he was out of his body, watching all this going on. And then he was adamant that his grandmother knew this man. A 7-year-old girl, describes arriving in the pediatric intensive care unit at St Mary's and feeling very calm and peaceful, nice beginning, was observing herself from the end of her bed, standing next to a boy who she didn't know. So again, that was interesting, but this boy apparently didn't have wings, a little bit older. So the sorts of experiences that you get are very much like those shown by Melvin Morse. And we need really more work done on that. So if any of you work in a kids' hospital, it'd be really nice to do it because you get them. And why should you do this? Children are less likely to have been exposed to the idea of NDEs. I mean, which of you have taught your 3 and 4-year-olds about NDEs? You're going to have this when you go unconscious. Don't think so. Young children especially have a poorly formed view of the idea and permanence of death. Children whose parents have no religious views or convictions are less likely to have spoken to them about what to expect at death, angels, wings, all that sort of thing. And Harvey Unwin has suggested that preschool children who had no religious instruction, I asked what the dominant religion in Sweden was as we were coming here, and they said pagan. I mean, they were teasing me. But it makes this point. So if you have a group of people that don't have very strong religious beliefs and don't teach their young children, it'd be ideal to test the sociological culture and conditioning hypothesis against a paranormal spiritual hypothesis, do you see? So it gives an opportunity for that. Okay, now this is a very important area. We come to answer your question on Sue Blackmore's anoxia. The first prospective study of cardiac arrest was our study, which was done by Sam Parnia in Southampton. I wanted to do this in 1999 at St Thomas's Hospital, and I asked the ethics committee to give me approval for it. And the head of the ethics committee was the head of intensive care. And when I came up before the ethics committee, he said, what did I want to do? And I said I wanted to ask them if they had experiences when they were unconscious. And he drew himself up to his full height and said, nobody in my unit has experiences when they're unconscious. And he wouldn't let me do this study. So this was a qualitative and quantitative study. Now, I don't know if you remember, but we were looking at the incidence of near-death experiences, and they were 10%. So we wanted to find out if this was true if you did a prospective study, but more important, do they occur before you go unconscious? Do they occur during unconsciousness, during recovery, or after recovery? Now, there is one statement there which would change neuroscience in a fundamental way if it was correct. And that is if they occur during unconsciousness, because we know what happens to the brain in cardiac arrest. We know the sorts of alterations in neurotransmitters and so on. So it's a very important statement. So we wanted to find out if we could when it occurred. And what we did, or what Sam did, was he put cards on the ceiling. So when they left their bodies and went up to the ceiling, they would read our cards and come down and say, hey guys, we saw this card. And we would also be able, because it's a prospective study, we know what happened during the resuscitation, so we'd be able to time it. Cardiac arrest survivors over 18 weren't to be confused. They had to agree, the medical team had to agree, and we used the Grayson scale, which is a standard scale. What did we find? We found NDEs. 10% approximately. Feelings of peace and joy, sense of harmony, bright lights, heightened senses, encountering mystical beings, encountering barriers of no return. So there was nothing that we could say about these which were different from the NDEs in our first study. Somebody give me a figure, guess if you don't know, for the percentage of people who come out of a cardiac care unit after a cardiac arrest. How many people survive a cardiac arrest? Give me a figure, somebody. I want to see if you've all been televisionized.
90%.
90% I have. Any others? 25% I have. 50. Well, first thing is it depends where you are. If you're in the UK, probably in Sweden too, 25 would be high, 20 is more likely. So don't get a cardiac arrest because you will do two things. You'll be brain damaged after it, and secondly, you may not live. And don't have your cardiac arrest in Iran, because I had a PhD student over there and we were going to do the study in Iran. And do you know what their percentage is? Practically zero. So you can't do this sort of study. So have your cardiac arrests in Sweden. So 63 cardiac arrest survivors. So you can multiply that up by 5. So about 350 people went through the cardiac arrest unit. 56 no memories, and 7 had memories. So 11%. Of those, 4 met the Grayson scale and 3 didn't. And of those 3, 2 were clearly NDEs. So it's about 10%, which is what we found before. But the interesting point about it is that there was no difference in the phenomenology of it. And everything that we looked at, their religion and so on, there was nothing which was different from those who didn't have it. So in cardiac care units, NDEs are classical. The rates are similar to previous estimates, which is about 10%. Now, the interesting thing for us was the patients said that the experiences occurred during unconsciousness. Now, this is the one you remember, which would change neuroscience if it's true. And it wasn't due to medication, electrolytes, blood gases, or anything. And this answers your question, because a lot of people there, they're totally anoxic. And so you can't use any anoxic explanation. The interesting question is, why doesn't everybody have one? We don't know that yet, although there's some theories. Yeah.
Yeah, you have the research of Professor Hilgard in psychology about the hidden observer. And so it seems most people can, during hypnosis, recall events from unconscious states, but they cannot do it consciously, only a separate part, a different kind of memory connected to the hidden observers.
Okay.
That means that even if some people have it, it might not be connected to the usual form of consciousness.
The question is, there are theories about being able to obtain memories when people are unconscious, but the question is going to be, what do you mean by unconscious? And unconscious in cardiac arrest, as I'll explain in a moment, is there is no brain function. So you're going to have a different set of theories for the memories, where they're stored, how they're recorded. And you won't be able to use standard neuroscience. These are the other studies. That was ours. Pim van Lommel's instance was 12, 23 for Schwanninger, 10% for Grayson's, and 25 for my PhD student who's now, in fact, finished her PhD. So they're all around the same, with 25 being high. I don't think that I will go into these too much, because a number of you are coming on Saturday when we can look at these studies in more detail. But this is the best one. If you're going to see one, Lancet 2001, volume 358, Pim van Lommel study. He reported 12%, as I said, was uninfluenced by duration of unconsciousness or arrest or by medication. And so he felt that he couldn't really speak to any specific factor, except those who were nearest to death tended to have an NDE, which is an interesting finding. Yeah.
Well, going back to this question, it seems that even if you don't remember experience or have an experience, you might have a positive transformation even if you don't remember your experience. It seems just if you have too little oxygen while being born, that increases IQ 10 to 12 points. And you have the research by Miss Atwater, that it seems that persons with extreme IQ seems to have had near-death experiences before age 5. And in general, I'm not sure of the necessity of the experience. It seems that just having been almost dead or dead or whatever, and returning transforms the
Yes.
brain.
Okay, so the question is, do you have to have a near-death experience to be transformed, or can you just have the transformation because you've had a coronary arrest? And fortunately we have some data on that now, and it comes from Pim van Lommel's studies, and he has figures on it, and here they are. What you're doing is you're looking at changes in social attitude, changes in religious attitude, NDEs, no NDEs, 2-year follow-up. And you can see that a lot of people do actually change in the no NDE group. So that answers your question. Just having a cardiac arrest can produce it. But it's higher in the NDE group. And 8 years on, it's even higher still. So these things slowly go up. So having had an NDE has a long-lasting effect. It also has a long-lasting effect on attitude or fear of death. You lose it more if you have an NDE, but you still lose it if you have just a cardiac arrest. But you become less fearful of death if you've had an NDE, and you're still less fearful of death if you've just had a cardiac arrest. So having something awful like a cardiac arrest does change it. Meaning of life, yes, increased meaning of life, 89% of NDEers 8 years later. So if you want a new way to get a meaning of life, have a cardiac arrest, make sure you get an NDE. There you go. Schroninger's study, they don't show much, and I want to get on because I'm aware of the time, so I won't actually do those, and I won't do Grayson's study, but essentially they are very much the same. Now, why is the cardiac arrest model important? It's important for this reason. It's a very good model of death. When your heart stops, you obviously have no detectable cardiac output, you have no respiratory effort, and you have absent brainstem reflexes. Now, those are the 3 cardinal signs of death. If one of you were on the floor and you had those 3 signs, I would say that you were dead. Now, you're reversible for a bit, but essentially those are the signs of death. So when you're unconscious because it is not working at a very deep level. No detectable, no cough reflex or fixed dilated pupil, so it's all the same. You have no blood pressure. If you compress the chest, you can only get your blood pressure up to 30 millimeters of mercury, and that's not enough to enhance cerebral circulation. So whatever these clever doctors are doing, they're not getting enough blood to the brain to restart it and maintain consciousness. So you won't start becoming conscious until the heart starts. And then, for various technical reasons about reflow and the changes which occur, you won't get full circulation in the brain for some hours after. So that's why you shouldn't have one. And the mental state, note, is always confusional. And here's an EEG taken somebody whose heart stopped. The heart stopped there. For 11 seconds they get normal EEG, then the EEG goes flat, and this is people thumping the chest. So the whole thing is a flat EEG. So there's no electrical activity going on. So, yes, this is just pointing out that survivors in a lot of studies are in fact very low. So remember then, in the cardiac arrest model, unconsciousness is total. All the modules which create our world are down. It's got confusional onset and offset, and there's no memory. And so it should be impossible to have clearly structured and lucid experiences. Do you see that? You can't do it when the brain's not functioning. And because of brain damage, memory should be significantly or severely impaired. So, what is going on? Yeah.
I have a question. How does this unconsciousness, this cardiac arrest, relate to the concept of brain being brain dead?
Brain dead is taken as when it's irreversible. So, if you've got all those signs I said, you're brain dead when it's irreversible. So, if this has been going on for 10 minutes, you're brain dead.
Right, but in this case, it's not.
It's not brain dead. It's got the signs of brain dead, being brain dead, but you're not because it recently happened and it's still reversible. But those signs aren't going to change, and it's only the length of time which will allow you to know whether they're truly brain dead or not. There are other things you can do as well, in fact. Okay, so here we are. When did the people who have cardiac arrest say that it occurs? They say it occurs during unconsciousness, and science says no. So it's now becoming really interesting, you must admit. This I've just drawn out for you to show you what actually happens in the cardiac arrest. Consciousness up there. Here's your level of consciousness, happily in the ward. Heart stops. Your level of consciousness falls very quickly. And then as the heart starts again, you're unconscious down here, then as the heart starts, it slowly recovers like that, but it's confusional, okay? Now, this is the time that the NDEs say it's happening. Now, why are they, logically, might they be correct? Well, your memory is continuous up to the point at which you become unconscious, and they don't say it occurred before unconsciousness, okay? They don't say it occurred after, and the characteristics of the experience, which are lucid and clear, and are not confusional, so it doesn't occur during the confusional period. So what are you left with? You're left with that period here, where science says it can't occur. Or if it does, then you have to have special sets of explanations. I won't go into this in any detail. We'll do this at the seminar. When you have severe anoxia in a cardiac arrest, you get glutamate secreted.
What is anoxia?
No oxygen. Thank you. And it may be related to glutamate, but I won't actually do that with you now. So when does it occur? Now, if we can time it and show that it actually does occur during the cardiac arrest, then it's going to be wonderful. And it would tell us something very fundamental about the nature of consciousness. If it doesn't occur then probably I could get many reductionist theories which would explain it to some extent. Now, the anecdotal evidence suggests that the OBE and so the NDE occurs during unconsciousness. These are people who have left their bodies and seen the resuscitation process, and we'll look at that a bit. Now, Sabom, did any of you read his first book, many years, 80s? Yeah, some of you read it. Any of you read his recent book? He's done another book. And the case of Pamela Reynolds isn't that. Sabom, as you probably know, he's a cardiologist was a cardiologist from a high-profile university. And he, after the publication of his first book, it was too early, and the medical profession couldn't accept NDEs. And he was thrown out of his university and had to go to the Midwest of America. He had an awful time. But he's been rehabilitated now and he's back with us. And what he says, if you look at the accounts of those people who have come out of their bodies and seen the resuscitation process and score them, and look at those who haven't, then those who say they saw the resuscitation process are much more accurate. Okay? So prima facie evidence that these people can actually see what's occurring when they're unconscious. Pamela Reynolds' case, I don't want to go into it in too much detail. do you all know the Pamela Reynolds case? You probably do you?
No.
Yes?
No.
No. Would you like to hear about it? You guys have got to see your football, you know. Pamela Reynolds is an interesting person. She had, in fact, a midbrain aneurysm. And no neurosurgeon can clip a midbrain aneurysm without killing the patient. They're very difficult to get at. So one hospital in the States devised a method in which they put you onto a cardiac bypass, cool you, empty the blood out of the brain, clip the aneurysm, warm you up, and you're okay. All right, easily said than done. But what they do is they instrument you in a very detailed way. And with Pamela Reynolds, she was given an anesthetic, and when she was unconscious, but there's queries about this, she left her body and was able to see the surgeon cutting her skull with the saw and described it accurately. She was able to describe the process of the catheter being put into her femoral artery, because it was too small on one side, so they put it in on the other. And she gave an account which the surgeon said was extremely good. But note that when the heart stopped, she went down a tunnel. So there's just this little area of whether in fact she had some brain function during the out-of-body experience. So we're not absolutely certain. It's just enough to make it an interesting, but not an absolute certainty. So, is the OBE truly veridical? And we don't have a video. Got a nice video of somebody who's had it, and he describes it very nicely. And he says he knows that during his cardiac arrest he came out, saw the resuscitation process, and that he knows that something, the soul, goes on after life because of it. And it's a nice, compelling account. So he decided to test this, and my PhD student in Morrison Hospital in the UK, in Wales, did this. And what she did, this isn't Wales, the equipment is a bit more high-tech, but it was the only one I could find on the net when I was in a hurry to get a picture. You've all seen on telly what happens. You have this machine which beeps beside the bed and so on, okay? Well, in fact, it is slightly high like that to get out of the way. So Penny put cards up there on the top of the monitor so that when people left their bodies up to the ceiling there and looked back at themselves being resuscitated, they would see the cards, okay? She changed the cards weekly and she did it nicely. And we all looked for the first person to leave the body. Well, by the end of the study, she had 16 people who left their body. Now then, if you were in an intensive care unit, you had a cardiac arrest, you left your body, and the hospital staff were trying to resuscitate you, what would you look at?
The cards.
Look at your body, wouldn't you? You'd want to know what these guys were doing to you. When you came out of your body, would any of you say, gosh, I wonder what the doctors are left around here that I might be able to see and tell them about? No way, you don't. So it's a badly designed experiment. So although people came out of their bodies, none of them looked on top of the monitors. When I made this slide, she had 6. She had, I think it wasn't 16, it was 8 altogether. One went out of a window, one went down a tunnel, one didn't look before returning, one went out backwards through the wall. In other words, there were lots of people who came out, had a look around, and disappeared. And so nobody looked on top of the monitors. So what we learned from that is that you've got to have a different experimental setup. So this is our new experiment. There you are in your hospital bed in the intensive care unit. Your heart stops. You're going to oblige us by leaving your body, okay? So then you're going to go up to the ceiling and you're going to watch yourself. So we know that we can't put anything around over there. So what we'll do is this. we'll have a display screen which is brought into the arrest, because they don't always happen just in the cardiac care unit, with a camera, so that the camera photographs the resuscitation, and the camera also photographs symbols which are on the screen with a time code, so you can see exactly when the symbols are being displayed, and the person will have to look through the screen or around the screen if it's up there. If they look at their body, they can't not see the screen. Now that's our new experiment. Now, is it going to work?
No.
That's what a number of people say. It won't work because they won't go up to the ceiling. They will come here. Or they see something funny, but it's not clear enough and they can't report it. So it may be like a lot of parapsychological experiments, but it's probably the best we can do. At least we would know that anyway. But we would be able to do a correlation between what they say they saw in terms of the resuscitation and what actually happened. Now, Penny, in fact, did that. And what she found was that if you took all the people who did not have an NDE of any sort and asked them to rate what happened during their resuscitation, so these are the people who have been watching, Emergency Ward 10 on the television and so on. They don't actually know what happened. So they said what they thought happened. And Penny asked those who had a near-death experience, came out of their bodies and watched the resuscitation, to say what they saw happened. And the people who came out of their bodies were highly accurate in what they saw, and it's highly significant. Whereas the ones who said didn't have an NDE, they got some things right, but a lot of things wrong. Okay? So again, it's evidence pointing that way, but it's not secure enough. Yeah?
I read research about out-of-body experiences and lucid dreams, and those who were able to project and remember or have very coherent dreams were also having more active brains. But those who couldn't, they just fell out of the bed because they didn't have sufficient control of the nervous system and motor system. So the coherence and integration of the motor inhibitions, acetylcholine system, wasn't as developed. So you could have a kind of selection effect here, that people who have more organized brains will have more near-death experiences and will give more accurate reports, etc.
The question is, why do some people have near-death experiences and some don't? And the argument, thank you, the argument put forward was that maybe the people who have near-death experiences have more organized brains in some way. Well, that may be true, but I don't know of any evidence really to support it. And it's a very difficult study to do because you have to get them before they have their cardiac arrest. But it's an interesting point and one which one would like to know the answer to. Yeah?
I'm very sympathetic to your hypothesis that the consciousness can exist without the brain, which I believe in from other reasons, but I don't think this addresses that question, because you do some things which are not possible to decide, because we must listen to people's experience, but then they say they experience it at the time of the OB. Well, if the retrocognition or precognition exists, you can have time referral, which could be, if you believe in the materialistic brain, which I don't do anyway, but you can have that hypothesis too. And when you say that, I'm a little perplexed about, you say that after 11 seconds you have flat EEG. I don't know how well studied that is, because there is other take on that. But even when you say that it must be at the time of the unconsciousness, because before they hadn't had experience and after they are confused, but perhaps there are two different experiences. Some are confused and some have near-death experience. And even if you flat EEG, how much do we know about the more depth or function in the brain? So I think it's a good way to address it, but I don't think it goes the way through.
Okay. Your points are all good ones. I'll deal with the parapsychological one in a moment. Let's deal with the question of, I showed you an EEG which was flat, and I then went on to say that there's an absence of electrical activity. Now, the reason I said that is because there is a very large literature of what happens when you tie the carotid arteries in animals, mainly dogs. And we know for exactly how long brain activity occurs after you've tied the carotid arteries or stopped the heart. And one of the reasons for that, and why people have done it, is that there are a number of drugs which are said to be protective in cardiac ischemia. So, in cerebral ischemia. So the knowledge on brain function when you stop blood flow to the brain is extensive. It's not just in man. And what you pick up from this literature is that if you put electrodes on the scalp, which is what those were, and you get a flat EEG, then you are, in fact, there is no electrical activity in the depth. And so this has been done with depth implanted electrodes as well in this model. So you can be pretty certain that there is no organized electrical activity going on. There's a lot of random firing, but there's no organized electrical activity. The other one, which is an interesting point, how do we know that it's not parapsychological? You can never get away from that. And this is why one would have to be very careful about the selection of the symbols and make sure people don't see them so it's not telepathic, etc. But I would think of those explanations as a second order. What I'd like to see is somebody come out of their body, see the symbols, then I will have done what I needed to do. You guys can go on and argue about, argue about it. But if I get that level of proof, then everybody will tear it to bits. But that's why the experience has got to be, the experiment has got to be done properly.
The studies of the cases, I should say, of patients with flat EEGs and who report near-death experiences. How many cases are there of that, and what sort of time dimension does this concern? How long have they had a flat EEG for?
All right. It's a really interesting question. Did you all hear it? It relates to the question of cardiac arrests and flat EEGs. And the questioner said, do we know how long the EEGs have to be flat for? Is there any evidence what happens in the cardiac arrest in terms of the EEG? Could it be possibly that the EEGs were firing away in some sense underneath because they weren't measured? So how many have been measured? Now this is a really good question. Now just go back to hospital, would you? And your doctor has referred you up to have an EEG. So what you do is you go to the department and a nice technician takes you in and puts 23 electrodes. That was a 23 set of electrodes that they had on their scalp. This is precisely measured. It will take them about half an hour. And then they will set everything up and probably they'll be ready to record in about 40 minutes, 30 to 40 minutes, okay? Now, believe you me, this is not going to happen in the cardiac arrest. Excuse me, all you guys who want to do something, hang about. I'm going to put these nice electrodes on and measure them. So you're not going to get that quality of data, but there is a new machine which has just come out from the States, which is called the Biss Analyzer. It was made for monitoring brain activity in anesthetics, and it gives just one figure. High Biss score, your brain's good. Low Biss score, your brain is bad. Now, how are you going to get the Biss monitor on? It has 3 electrodes, and they can be put on very quickly. 1, 2, 3, ideal. Yes? So we can start to answer your question, but we've had one at the Hammersmith Hospital now for 6 months. How many Biss monitors have we got of the cardiac arrests that they've had there? 3. Why? Because the resuscitation officer, whose job it is to take the Biss monitor along and put it on, is doing other things. Either he's teaching, so he doesn't go to that arrest, or it's a difficult arrest and he feels he has to roll his sleeves up and do something about it. So the data is not good in those terms, but in a sense it doesn't have to be, because the physiological data of what happens when the heart stops is really secure. So you can from that say, it'd be nice to have Biss scores on everybody, and I hope that we will do in another hospital, but at the moment they're difficult to get.
Would it be the intention to use these Biss monitors to actually determine the final death versus cardiac arrest?
Here you enter into a tiger's cage. Because the neurologists say, I can tell when he's dead. No heart, no respiration, no brainstem reflexes, go home guys. No point. And so
Going home.
they don't like it. And so in more litigious places, like across the pond, sometimes before they turn off a respirator, they put an EEG on. But it's not common. Yeah.
Well, we're speaking about the time of objective death, but there's a time, subjective time, and probably that sense of time is different too. But how, they have these experiences, they will walk out and so on, so you could calculate how many seconds that would take. So if you have an 11-second experience during an 11-second span, that could match. On the other hand, we have like the Kubler-Ross experience, very near death, or maybe when you have lots of glutamate, whatever, your sense of time might change. So you might do many things and experience a lot of time during a very short span. So actually it could be just a very small part of the actual time curve. You could imagine a lot of things during that time. Since you don't have a body to move around, and so it could be more...
Okay, now I understand that. The question is, can our sense of time be compressed during a cardiac arrest, so that you can, rather like Freud thought dreams occurred like that as soon as you wake up, sort of firecracker hypothesis of dreams. Could it be a firecracker hypothesis of near-death experiences, that they all occur as you're going down? Now, that would be possible, but it wouldn't be possible with the experiment which we plan, because we will have an absolute time for the occurrence of the NDE, because the time when the guy leaves his body. We'll have cameras, we'll know exactly what's going on. We can answer your question, how long have they been unconscious for? We can answer all those questions. And we'll have real data in real time, which we all appreciate. So you won't be able to have your theory. Okay, look, it's 25 past, time for...
Prepare for a break in 5 minutes?
No, prepare for a break now. Because I'm sure that you'd like to do that. Now, you're going to all have to make a decision. I went through this more fully than I meant to, because it seemed to me that you were interested and wanted something at this level. So it's taken me much longer, and I would have done it much more shortly, but you seemed keen and interested, so I did it. That means that I haven't told you anything about approaching death. And what we can do, if you like, is we can stop the presentation here, go and have a nice chat amongst yourselves, come back and have some questions and stop it, or I can tell you a little bit about approaching death. But then it'll run into your question time, do you see? So you have to make a decision. All those who would like to come back and just ask and answer questions, all those who would like that. So you're going to go for your break now. Then when you come back, you can have a little introduction to approaching death, and maybe the odd question, but look, the time, all of you want to see Sweden play, so you're going to have a very, very short break, with a very short question time, or you can just have questions. So all those who want just questions, put their hands up. Okay. All those who want to, you may all be sitting on the phones, all of those who want to hear a little bit about approaching death, put your hands up. I don't get away with it, do I? Okay, fine. See you back here whenever.